Welcome to the Meta Life podcast. I am your host, Laura. Come with me on a journey for a happy life. On today's episode, Feka and I are talking about resilience. Feka, welcome to the podcast. Before we talk about serious things, I want to hear about the story behind your name, please.
Well, thank you, Laura. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to be here with you. Well, the story behind my name comes from colonial Angola. I was born in Angola. I think it's 15 years after colonialism, actually, about 14 to 15 years. And my great-great-grandfather was born under colonial rule in Angola. And so what happened at the time is that when a child was born, they would then send him or her off to the local authorities, the Portuguese authorities, to give it a name, to register it. And so, with an African name, it would usually be something like a Mutiakavela, a Kwikwi, Sachemamo, something of the sort. And so they would tell this to the Portuguese authorities, and they would generally say, no, this is too complicated. Your name is Eduardo. Your name is Luis. Your name is, something Portuguese. Also a way, of course, to kind of destroy a cultural aspect which comes with your name. So the name Feka was actually my grandfather's name, because in my culture, the firstborn son is usually given the name of the grandparents, along the line of the mother and father. And so that's the story about my name.
What is your government name, your Portuguese name?
My Portuguese name is Eduardo.
Okay, so I know that most people at work and in your professional life know you as Eduardo, but what do you think if we call you Feka from now on, because it is your real name and we want to honor this on this podcast?
That's perfect. Let's do it.
Let's do this.
Yeah.
Okay, Feka, you were born in 1989. Can you tell us about the situation in Angola at that time and how it was for you as an infant and as a child to live there?
Yeah, in 1989, at that time, Angola was engaged in a civil war already for, I think, almost 12 years, around there. And so growing up, being born there and then growing up at that time, as you can imagine, was not necessarily easy. There was always situations of unknowns, right? For example, what would today bring? But at the same time, as a child, that's all you know. You're a toddler, you're growing up in a situation that you don't fully understand. You see things that you don't fully understand. And I think I really credit my parents, especially my mother, my grandmother, and my aunts, who basically were the ones that raised me from infancy up until, into teenagehood or adulthood. And so in Angola, it was them sheltering me from, at least at the start, from the brutalities of life and what came with it. To a certain degree, I kind of grew up not really understanding the war context, because I was shielded from these women, by these women rather, from those realities. It was only a little bit when I came to learn to understand what was happening, that the impacts of it fully dawned on me, and I could tell a little bit of what was happening.
And how has the war in Angola impacted you when you were growing up and now today as an adult?
Wow, that's a tough question. But I think that the war in Angola has it's fully traumatized me. I think it's things which I still deal with and which I still carry a lot of trauma from. I think it's of course not just because of the war itself, but I think that when you grow up in such a context, a society of war is in your skin. It's in your blood. It's in how you walk. It's in how you talk, and you kind of learn to be in a kind of survival mode, which kind of really goes into your bones, right? And it's very difficult to escape that. And so today, even, it's a kind of feeling which I still carry with me. I'm not really used to permanence, right? In the sense that I can stay here and this is where I'll stay for the rest of my life, right? I think that in many ways I still have a mindset that everything might fall apart and I need to move. But at the same time, I've also kind of taught myself that even if and when that happens, it's okay, you know? And
Do you mean the feeling of having to move is okay, the feeling of uncertainty, or the feeling of, yes, I have these feelings of uncertainties, but I will stay and I will calm myself? I'm not sure I understood.
I think it's all the above, really. It's
Okay.
the feelings of uncertainty, it's the feelings of non-permanency, it's the feelings of not knowing what is going to happen. But it's also the feeling of knowing that what you have right now will fall,
Yeah.
right? And with that, you kind of say, it's okay, you'll manage. But at the same time, that's dangerous.
Yeah, that's what I was
Because, yeah.
thinking. So what happens to you when you are in a good situation? Does your brain automatically go to the place of like, ooh, I'm going to lose this, it's going to fall apart? Do you catch yourself doing that and you reassure yourself, no, it's fine, I am in a safe place, I'm in a happy place, I am good? Or is it automatically, oh God, the ground is shaking behind me?
I think that I have to say that, I think a number of people who have kind of had this, who have had or gone through this situation, they might interpret it in a very different way, right? And I think for me, when it comes to stability, I create scenarios of instability.
Okay,
right?
That makes sense.
In the sense that I am always ready if something happens. For example, we're sitting here in beautiful Vevey, but at the back of my mind, I can always switch into a context in which something's happening and I need to leave, or I'm in danger and something needs to be done. And so it's that feeling of uneasiness, which, of course, it's trauma, but at the same time, it's all that you know, right? And I think that when something like this is all that you know, it becomes very difficult to change it. But it also impacts everything.
Do you think it is possible to change it?
I think definitely. I don't know how, right? But I think there's definitely a way to change it.
Is it something you would be interested in, or does the uncertainty comfort you in some sense, and the stability makes you very uncomfortable on the other hand?
That's a tough question for me to answer personally, because in one hand, I think it's almost like it's in my DNA to be this way, right? And on the other hand, I also see it's problematic because it impacts every single aspect of your life. It impacts your work, your relationships, the way that you engage with the world in general. But I also feel at the same time that, the world is a very difficult place.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that there are those that are privileged enough to experience a different kind of difficulty. But at the same time, I also know that the world is very kind and very good to people. This is something which I learned from my grandmother in some of the most difficult moments of our lives, right? And so for me, I always battle between these, the pendulum is always swinging in between these things. But going back to your question, I'm not sure if I want to change that. Because while I know that the world can be very kind and a wonderful place, I also know that the world can be extremely difficult. And I think that, my life story has kind of taught me to adapt and to survive. I often feel that the world is going towards a place of I'll use this word knowing that maybe it's controversial.
Okay.
In the sense that it's becoming very soft. In the sense that people are becoming or are very soft. And I think this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? I think that depending on where you are, it's okay to be that way, right? Because of where you grew up, because of the advantages that you have had. It's okay to allow that softness to come into your life. But I think that, depending how what your experiences were, it doesn't mean that you cannot get to that softness, but rather it's tougher to get to that softness.
Obviously, yeah.
And I think for me, when I see this softness, I suppose, of people, for me that scares me, right? To kind of get to that, to those aspects of softness.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not just interpret softness as one thing. There's many nuances to it. I'm not saying don't be a gentle and kind person. That's important. I'm saying that I think people have a more difficult time to deal with
hardship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And speaking about gentle and kind, you are the example of a gentle and kind human to me.
If you say.
And to everyone who knows you.
Wow.
Can you tell us a bit more about your life now and what happened between that childhood in Angola, where you were in the midst of the war, and the end of the war, and where you're now? Because I think it really reflects a big progression of leaving war and walking towards peace from your personal and your professional perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think you can ever leave war, actually. I think, at least for me personally, there's always this aspect of phantom pain, right? It's there. Sometimes you wake up and you feel it somehow. And then maybe you're there for a few minutes and then you realize, but no, it's okay. You're not, this part is gone. And so the worst, my experience as a child and with my family, because my family was heavily involved in the war, I lost many family members. I lost my father. I've lost uncles to the conflict. That really deeply scarred me, and I think also my own experience through it has scarred me. And so I think that's kind of why I somewhat moved towards this life that I have now of trying to be a so-called human rights activist, right? And I think while I am in this line of work, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a kind of work that I truly enjoy, and that's the strange thing about it. I don't feel like it's being in the human rights field, it's really something that I would have done if I had not had my past experience. Believe it or not, I wanted to be a psychiatrist.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But, I grew up in a situation where almost every member of my family was very much actively involved in the conflict. And so there was a huge theme of sacrifice, self-sacrifice in my family, in the sense that, you sacrifice for others. For example, there's always this example of my father where, he sacrificed for the Angolan people, or he sacrificed for the betterment of his society and for his family. And so there's always been this strong aspect of sacrifice in my family, in the sense that you give as much as you can towards something, and never necessarily for yourself or for you. And so I think that was a huge guiding aspect which has led me into my work. But at the same time, I also empathize deeply with suffering. For example, you turn on the news and you see people dying in Sudan, you see people dying in Yemen, you see people dying in Syria. And these are things which for me I have a lived experience with. And so it's something which touches very deeply. And so that explains a little bit why I am in the line of work that I am. Yeah.
So let's move backwards a few years. I think it was a few, well, let's say in your 20s, you were in South Africa. You obviously fled Angola, and then you were also a student in South Africa. Can you tell us about your human experience from moving to a country in war to a country in peace, and also what happened while you were there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always, in Angola, there's a famous, well, so-called famous march of refugees. At certain points during the war, people were marching, from Angola to Namibia, trying to escape the conflict. And, during those marches, it was, people would die on the way, right? It was men, women, children, the elderly, usually those who could not survive the march, they would be, left to die. But at the same time, it was impossible choices, because if you wait, you can also be killed. So there was this transition from a country at peace, a country at war, towards a country at peace, right? And so you do whatever it is that you can to survive. And I think my experience was, I can't really say it was a transition, because even when you are in this peaceful place, there isn't really much peace, right? Because you still leave people behind, right? You still leave your loved ones behind. And so I think while being away and while leaving so many people behind, it's a difficult thing to kind of wrap your head around. So, I always think that, people who are refugees have a certain kind of heart.
Yeah.
Because of course you flee, but, physically you flee. But I think your mind and perhaps your heart, or what they call your soul, is still stuck into that in that place. And so for me, my experience was of an out-of-body experience, right? You have now reached safety, but at the same time, you are still there, because you know what is happening there. You know what your friends are facing. You know what your family is facing. But I eventually stayed in South Africa. I went on to study, not psychology like I wanted to, but because of this push and pull kind of aspect. In one hand, I felt that going more into this international law aspect, or trying to understand the world more, I would be more useful. So I would say that even my choice of career was a traumatic response.
Yeah, purely.
To my past, right? It was a traumatic response to what had happened. And it was an attempt to try to, at least for me, to play a small role in trying to figure out ways for it not to happen again. Yeah.
And then you also had a horrible health diagnosis a few years ago. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, that was I told myself, man, this is some really bad luck. Who must I have been in my previous life? When I was 26, I think I was 26 at least, I was diagnosed with brain cancer. And, I was on holiday with friends. And I got this call from the doctor, because I was feeling not so well for the past few weeks. And he says, well, you have brain cancer and you need to start treatment immediately. And so I think, I took the news. Um, the news came, and I think I didn't fully understand it.
Yeah, I don't think
Right.
anyone can understand. It's like an out-of-body experience again.
Yeah, I didn't really understand it. But in any case, I finished up the rest of my 2 days of the holiday. Then I went back
Good.
to Pretoria to kind of start the madness. And so the doctor said, well, it should have been picked up quicker, but it wasn't. And so maybe there's a few months that you can live to a year. And it's always funny that doctors always say 6 months. I don't know if that's like a certain code that they have against each other or with each other when they say, if someone has cancer, let's just say 6 months.
Okay.
So I started treatment, and within, I think, a year or so, or perhaps less, I was in remission. And at the same time, and then it came back, the cancer, a little bit more aggressive than before. And then the option was for brain surgery, which I eventually had. And then, of course, I was cancer-free. And then, of course, the cancer came back. And so for me, I think it wasn't necessarily the fear of dying for me, but I think, especially as I was going through this process of the treatment, it was really just the fear of how, getting there, right? Because over those months with treatment, I've met so many people who were going through similar health struggles, right? And I could see how painful it was, and I could see how difficult it was. And so my fear was more about how exactly you're going to get there. And I think that, most people usually say that, when you're faced with a difficult diagnosis or a life-threatening diagnosis, your life kind of flashes before your eyes, and you kind of think of, oh my goodness, I could have just lived life better. But, I think for me, I didn't really have that. I think for me, it was just saying, wow, okay, this is now happening. There's no point for me to think of all that could have been. There really isn't. And so perhaps what I could do was just try to be more intentful with what I was doing, right? So as opposed to thinking my life has flashed before my eyes, I'm going to change my entire life. I think that for me, it was just really a focus on being more intent with what I was doing and how I was doing it.
How do you find inner peace and confidence in life once you have been through war, numerous cancer, numerous remissions? What makes you get up in the morning?
I think it's really the realization that life is not fair.
Yeah.
Right?
We forget this, especially in the West.
Yeah.
We always think bad things happen, but they happen to other people. And we forget bad things happen to everyone, including us. But you had a lot of bad things happening. I
did. And, I thought about this, and I told myself that, because I once asked the question, but why? And the simple answer is, why not?
Why not?
Right? Really, why not? And I think it's just knowing that the why not, knowing that life is not fair, and knowing that whether you believe in fate or destiny, you still have a choice.
Oh, I love this.
Right? You still have a choice to wake up in the morning and do whatever it is that you want to do based on your own realities, because we forget that sometimes that we don't all have the same reality, right?
Yeah.
But I think that we can all do something with what we have and where we are. And that's it, I think.
That's very powerful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Wow, that was a very, very fabulous note, and it has been incredible talking to you. And before we conclude this episode, I want our listeners to get to know you a little bit better, and I want to ask you a few burning questions. Would that be okay with you?
Let's go for it.
Let's go for it. Okay, so first burning question. What do you want most out of this life, especially considering what you have been through?
Peace of mind, I hope.
Can you get it?
I can definitely strive towards it. I don't think it'll come, but I can definitely strive towards it. And I think that's the process.
Okay, I have a parenthesis to make. Do you think tools like meditation, talking about the trauma can be helpful for people who went through this?
Yeah, I think they definitely can.
Yeah.
I just have not tried it fully. And I think that's something that is still in the cards for me, perhaps, to try.
Okay. I just want to briefly address something in that regard. Some of my African friends told me, I don't need therapy. I'm African or I'm Black. Do you have something to say to this?
I do, actually. I think that, again, we, many Africans, we grew up in a context of survival, right?
Yeah.
And I think personally for me, I know that there's many things that I need to address, right? And I think which also might link to that question is that I simply do not have the time for it, right? Of course, we always have a brief moment here, but I think for me, it's an active decision that I'm making that while there are many things that I need to face and deal, I am somehow relegating it to the back of my mind. But this is with the knowledge that it will come out.
Good.
Right. And it will impact me depending on which stage of my life that I am. And I think that perhaps also just linking that to, to your African friends who have made those comments, I believe that, we come from such a different place.
Yeah.
Right. And that every day it's really a question of survival. Where we live, what we have to do to get by every day, right? The struggles that we have. And sometimes therapy is not necessarily a priority over putting food on the table. Yeah. Right? It's not a priority over ensuring that, your family is okay. I don't know if you heard about black tax.
Yes.
Many of us carry the weight of our families, right? And so while therapy is important, I think it's also important to also have in mind that let me rephrase, not cultural, but that context, that social context and reality.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, so back to the burning questions. Can you please complete these sentences? The world needs more
kindness.
I agree. And I am grateful for
my mother.
Oh, bless you. And the most important question of the interview, obviously I'm joking. If there was one thing I could cook for you, what would it be?
Rice and beans.
Rice and beans it is.
Yeah. Good.
Feka, I appreciate you being on the podcast. I am very grateful for you being so generous with your time. Thank you very much. And to everyone listening to this podcast or watching it, if you think this podcast might help someone in your life, please pass it along. Thank you for everyone and goodbye.
Thank you, Laura.
Goodbye.